From the medieval, we move into the Romanesque. Now, the Romanesque is effectively a continuation of the medieval, but we're starting to see this development of art and culture, which is going to transition into the Gothic and the Renaissance. Arguably, you kind of have the Renaissance starting already in the Romanesque. Now, this era takes its name from its defining characteristic, which is that most of the architecture looks very Roman-like, so Romanesque. In the style of the Romans, we see the use of arches, we see the use of a lot of columns, although they're not going to be those classical columns, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian that we saw in the classical world. But it's going to be picking up on these ideas. Why? Because they're surrounded by Roman ruins. This is around the year 1000. They are much closer to the Romans than we are today. They're in Europe. And of course, the Romans have left their garbage everywhere. And they're just looking at this and going, wow, let's start using arches and other things. This is actually a pejorative term, an insulting term created by 19th century art historians to basically say, well, they weren't doing anything really cool and interesting. Because art historians are kind of jerks and constantly think that the classical world, the Greeks primarily, and the Renaissance are the two high points, and we will never ever meet that again should we live in a world where there are never any more Ninja Turtles. Roman monuments would have been everywhere. Aqueducts, triumphal arches, temples. This would have been a reasonable landscape to come across. In fact, this is the city of Rome. Early Romanesque architecture is often very austere, so very simple, very strict. We see little decoration, a focus on rounded arches. It's mindful, it's demure, it's whatever that meme is. And quickly there becomes an emphasis on sculptural embellishment. They're going to start adding sculpture to the outside. So as we look at these churches, as they evolve, we go from something fairly basic, like St. Michael's at Hildesheim at the end of the medieval, and we start to move towards something highly sculpted that you would recognize potentially as a cathedral, almost bordering on Gothic cathedral at the time. There is no single uniform definitive style. We see a lot of regional variation. For example, what we see in France is vastly different from what we will see in Italy. And we see a rise in artistic identity, artists starting to sign their work, trying to be recognized for what they've done, becoming a little bit more than simply an artisan, as if they were a plumber or an electrician, who, of course, you would never have signing their work. So there are several changes happening throughout this period. We also have to talk about the religious mood. Things have changed dramatically. Around the year 1000, many people start experiencing millennial fear. So they fear that if, the calendar hits the year 1000, then that must be the end of the world and Jesus is coming back and everything is going to end. And we sit there and we laugh and go, ha ha ha. That would never happen. Those foolish, foolish people. Let me remind you what happened in 1999 when we thought that the same thing was happening. We didn't think that necessarily the religious aspect, but we were convinced airplanes would fall from the sky on New Year's Eve, that all the computers would shut down and everything else. And so this is not unusual. People get really caught up on time frames, on rounded numbers. So when nothing happens, because of course now looking back, we know nothing happened, there's a sense of relief and a new enthusiasm for building projects. And you have two kinds of people at this point. One who gave away everything because they thought the second coming was on its way. And so they are going to focus on religion because it's all they have left. And then we have the hedonists who went out and spent everything they had. When nothing happened, they now have to make up for what they did, and so they're going to give as much as they can again to the church. We also live in the period of the Crusades, or that's starting in this period in the 12th century. So during the Crusades, we see armies of Europe going to liberate the Holy Lands. This does not work well. There are, by some estimates, most history books will tell you there are 4 Crusades, aren't there? Between 13 and 22 Crusades, including the Children's Crusade, where bunch of kids got together and thought that they would walk across the Mediterranean, God would part the waters. Well, 30,000 of them turned up at Marseille, and they found ships that had turned up there that were ready to help them out. And then the children were never seen again because the ships were slave ships. We have the Georgian Crusade that tried to start, had 30,000 troops in a field in was currently the Russian state of Georgia. And they were ready to march on their own crusade. Unfortunately, who should come over the hill but the Mongols? A scouting party of about 15 to 20,000 Mongol troops, and completely decimated the Georgians where they stood. That's the definition of wrong place, wrong time. We also have the Fourth Crusade, which we've talked about. It sacks Constantinople. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. We have pilgrimages. Now, this has nothing to do, well, here's the Crusades, because I forgot that I had that slide, but it gives you an idea of several of the Crusades. There are only 6 of them here, but again, there are many, many more that actually happened. We have pilgrimages. So this is best understood as medieval tourism. What you would do is you would travel from your city to the best known relic in the area that you could afford to get to. And relics are basically bits of dead saint, or in some cases, entire dead saints, who you would go to. And the belief is if you're in the presence of this piece of the person or the remains of the person, or something closely related to them, that somehow your prayers would get through to God just a little bit quicker. This fuels a literal pilgrimage industry, and as we're going to see, we see churches developing. Oftentimes the churches are where you would stop and stay for the night as you continue on the pilgrimage, because obviously Best Western and Super 8 haven't actually developed yet. And we can only wonder what the continental breakfast might have been like. But when you would sleep in one of these churches, you would leave some money as a donation, and the church has more money, so they want to bring in more people. So they expand the church so that you can sleep in there, and you get the sense of the cycle continuing. All of this going on, all of this shift happening, giving us the Romanesque.